Hello! Today I'm returning to my 6k subs celebration of Final Fantasy VI, with a look at the character of Celes. Now, I've discussed Final Fantasy VI a few times on the channel, and it's been interesting to see how much of the commentary and feedback on these episodes has been Final Fantasy fans citing Celes as one of their, if not their most favourite character in this game. And while I've recently discussed characters such as Locke and Terra, who are often cited as foremost among this ensemble cast, and elevated to the extent that they represent Final Fantasy VI in other media, such as Dissidia, for example, there's certainly a case for Celes being regarded as the people's favourite of Final Fantasy VI. And furthermore, that she builds in significance in the second half of the game, being the feature of the momentous opera sequence, and being the primary character we control when we arrive at the world of Rune. So, kicking off, Celes is stumbled upon in the game events by Locke when he's attempting to sabotage the Empire's advance in South Figaro, and immediately she's established as a formidable yet conflicted character, and even by the standards and limited graphics of the day, there is something quite brutal and memorable about her introduction and this torture sequence that she endures at the hands of the Castalian guards. But I think this is great at establishing her, and this establishing shot and the entire rescue sequence with Locke is one of the best character recruitment scenarios that I think we see in Final Fantasy VI, because it communicates so much in a short space of time. Celes is shown to be a high-ranking Magitech knight fallen foul of the Empire. She's shown to be horrified by the poisoning at Doma that Kefka is planning, and she's shown to be defiant both in the face of torture but also in the face of this stranger, Locke, attempting to rescue her and protect her. And so, very concisely, we build out this inner conflict and mystique and central dilemma around Celes, in the first couple of minutes of meeting her. Looking more broadly at her arc in the game, I think it's easy to see how she became a fan favourite, because she leans into some tried and true character archetypes from RPG and wider literature, but also, with respect to Final Fantasy, she had some pretty momentous scenarios that hadn't really been seen before. And in fact, some of the most impactful, emotive cutscenes in the game belong to Celes, and once again, the emotive power of the words and music belays the graphics of the day to create some quite powerful cutscenes and moments in Final Fantasy VI. For example, one of the first Final Fantasy characters I ever discussed on the channel was the minor character of Dyne, who features in Final Fantasy VII, and among other things, he is quite significant in being one of the first, and indeed I think one of the only suicides that we see in a Final Fantasy game. But before this, we had Celes in Final Fantasy VI, and her tragic cutscene following the potential death of her adoptive father figure of Cid. And in a fit of despair and loneliness, we see her, attempt suicide by jumping off a clifftop. And this is significant, not only contextually, because it is the lowest point of Final Fantasy VI in terms of story, really. The world's just been completely destroyed, and there's little room for hope here. So Celes's tragedy just compounds this poignant low ebb of the storyline. But furthermore, Final Fantasy games up to this point had been the sort of wisty high fantasy you'd expect from young adult fiction, and things were never truly bad, or never really irredeemably bad. And quite often the fellowship of friends that comprise your party were always around to save one another, support one another, and so on. But with Final Fantasy VI, as I discussed in my recent episode talking about the narrative structure of the game, it did take a turn towards the irredeemably bad, and it entertained a sort of dark hopelessness in its tone that previous games hadn't. And as I've mentioned in the past, I think they very consciously broke apart this large ensemble fellowship of characters in the world of Ruin, precisely because they wanted this tone to take hold. And I think it was poignantly delivered in this moment by Celes jumping off the cliff. So that was a profound break from the JRPG norm that set Final Fantasy VI apart, I think. The second important sequence, including Celes, that preceded this is the opera sequence. And again, those that champion Final Fantasy VI, particularly as an art form, and it truly is one of these games that elevated the medium, along with Final Fantasy VII and VIII, I think, And people that champion this, and in particular champion Celes as a character, they often point to the opera sequence as one of the most important aspects of the game. And while I agree, I think it is interesting to really step back and consider why the opera sequence worked and why it worked so effectively. Now, first and foremost, we should remember that actually this entire scenario is intended as an act, and on the surface at least, it's an unimportant throwaway sequence, because what's happening in terms of story is that we've infiltrated the opera as Celes, masquerading as the singer Maria, because what we're trying to do is entrap the airship captain Setzer, so that we have possession of him and the airship. And he intended to abduct the genuine opera singer Maria to try and marry her. So this entire scenario is a facade and a ploy to acquire the airship and progress our adventure. But unlike comparable scenarios, such as the excellent opening act of Final Fantasy IX, where we similarly masquerade in a play to infiltrate Alexandria Castle, rather than employing goofy humour and the stuff that usually goes along with an identity-swapping scenario, which generally tend to be quite humorous, Celes delivers the opera with surprising emotiveness and sincerity, and once again, even by the limitations of the day, that didn't yet have full orchestrals or cutscenes or audio singing, for example, it was a surprisingly potent scene, and I think it was a turning point for Celes as a character, where she finally opened up, let her feelings out, and in this moment, despite it being an act within an act, it was a great moment of the game, and it's quite telling that the music from the opera went on to become her character theme in later stages of the game. So it kind of echoes out from this and shows what an important scenario this is. And I suppose, taking a step back and looking at why this is so important, is that Celes is quite a tragic character, really. And if we look at her backstory, her biography, she was taken from a young age and infused with magic, and essentially experimented on by her adoptive father, Cid. And since then she became a battle-hardened general that is known to have laid waste to enemies and lands in the name of the Empire. So really, she is quite an interesting bridge between the Empire and the Returners, you know, the good and the bad. This bridge between Terra and Kefka, I think. She's kind of a mix of the two. And where many Final Fantasy games have an intrinsic link between hero and villain, which I've discussed in the past, and only Kefka and Ultimecia are sort of anomalies to this trend in Final Fantasy, which I think in part is why the Rinoa-Ultimecia theory takes hold in discussions around Final Fantasy VIII, because it's a convenient way to loop Ultimecia into the central story and the central characters more. I think if we look at what happened to Kefka and what happened to Celes, there is a curious consistency between these two, and part of me feels that Celes is so messed up and so disgusted by Kefka because she sort of sees a commonality between them. And for example, you know, they are both generals in the Gestalian Empire, they are both products of experimentation and magic augmentation, and they've both committed some pretty horrible acts in the past that many might consider to be irredeemable. So again, that connection and that consistent backstory between Kefka and Celes makes her even more interesting in my eyes, because she is this sort of link to him, and her having been conditioned to be an effective pawn of the Empire is what leads her to this wavering allegiance and self-doubt throughout the game events. And this brings me neatly onto the points of character archetypes that I touched on earlier, and the first among these is the duplicitous Judas or betrayer type character. And these tend to recur across fantasy fiction, media literature and RPGs, and within Final Fantasy we have had a number of these sorts of characters emerge, you know, whether they are noble in intention or not. So for example, we had Leon in Final Fantasy II, Kain in Final Fantasy IV, Ketchi or Katsis in Final Fantasy VII, and Vossler in Final Fantasy XII, to name but a few. And while Celes isn't a spy or anything to the extent that these characters are, from the outset she is slightly distrusted, and an altercation occurs between her and her blossoming potential love interest Locke, when Kefka states that she's actually still aligned to the Empire, which is quite an important sort of interpersonal dynamic and struggle between these two. Beyond this, the other character archetype she employs most prominently is that of the warrior woman, or the feminine warrior, which is a type that roots back to the Amazonians in myth, the goddess Athena, and beyond, and I think has generally been employed in most Final Fantasies since the debut of Celes, with both Freya Crescent and General Beatrix in Final Fantasy IX being among my favourites. We have Aranea in 15, Tifa in 7, Lightning in 13, and so on. But Celes comes with a certain fortitude and badassery in her own right, and prudently, what I think kind of compounds her character, and as I discussed in my Locke episode, is that she frequently denies his attempts to save her and protect her, because she's more than capable of doing this herself. And I really like how that was established from the outset, and I suppose, like the character of Freya in 9, the outer fortitude contrasts quite heavily with the inner emotiveness and uncertainty, so it creates a really compelling character to progress through this story with. So that about wraps up my short analysis of Celes, and to conclude, I think she's an excellent character, one of the first formidable females that we see in Final Fantasy, who escalates to become foremost among the ensemble cast in the latter stages of the game, and where each character has their own arc to sort of wrestle with and conclude, such as Terra's quest for identity, Locke's quest for redemption. I think Celes and her quest for moral absolution is one of the most compelling to witness over the course of Final Fantasy VI, and once again hallmarked by the momentous opera sequence and her later leap of faith. If you got this far, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to drop a comment below, letting me know your thoughts on Celes, and please consider sharing, subscribing, and checking the description below for more episodes and details about how you can support the channel.